Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Imam classifies these interpretations as ideology and madhahib as ideologies. And then the specific example of that is the difference between Hanbalis and Asharis as different ideological schools or madhahib. And specifically, Hanbalis and Asharis, Imam mentions them because historically Asharis and Hanbalis became rivals, and they had fights their fights, and they committed excesses against each other over the years and centuries, and they persecuted each other whenever one had dominance over the other. And that dispute continues to this day. And the historical context of that is that the Ashari school and when we call Ashari school, it's school has historical dimension. Any school has historical dimension, that is, they develop over time. So we can't say the Ashari school historically remained the same. It developed. Like Hanbali school, like Maturidi schools. And some schools develop more, some less, depending on their historical circumstances. And the schools have horizontal diversity as well. That is, when we call a school, it doesn't mean that the schools don't have sub-schools and internal. So when we compare schools to other schools, then we generally take those elements which are disputed among those schools and assume that as if that school is a monolithic structure. But if you look at a school, either it's a school within fiqh, or a school within tasawwuf, or a school within sarf or nahv, or a school within ilm al-kalam, they are all horizontally and vertically diverse. There are schools within schools. So, for example, in fiqh, if you look at Maliki school historically, you can at least find 4 or 5 schools, sub-schools within the Maliki schools. And same you can say about Hanafi schools and other schools. And the same applies to the schools and within Ilm al-Kalam or Ilm al-Aqaid. So Ashari school historically developed against Mu'tazila and other deviant sects within Ilm al-Kalam, within Ilm al-Aqaid. And when we talk about Mu'tazila or Jahmiya, for example, is sort of another school related to Mu'tazila. These schools are school within Ilm al-Kalam. So same imams of Mu'tazila, they might have some deviations as far as Ilm al-Kalam is concerned, but otherwise they might be Hanafis, or they might be, just like other mainstream Muslim scholars. And I'tizal and Jahm Jahmiya, they all have their levels. So not everybody who is called Mu'tazili is deviant in this on the same level. And similarly, not everybody who is Ashari or Hanbali is righteous at the same level, or on the right path on the same level. Because at the end of the day, it's not the schools which are judged, but the individual person as far as the responsibility and accountability is concerned. So historically, Asharis are the school which defended the Orthodox Islamic belief system against Mu'tazila and Jahmiya and other sects which were supported by the government at the time. And Asharis and their Imam belonged to Al-Hadith, the people who were specialized in Hadith and Tafsir. And basically, Imam Ashari and his school defended Ahlul Hadith generally, and Ahlul Hadith, they weren't well versed in logic, and they didn't specialize in logic and those tools which were used in Ilm al-Kalam by Mu'tazila and all others. So they weren't able to defend the Orthodox Islam in the same way. So which Asharis did, because they learned, even though they came from Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Tafsir and Orthodox Muslim, they learned philosophy and Kalam and Mantiq and its terminology and developed it and developed usul and those rational Islamic disciplines and used them in order to defend Islamic orthodoxy. And whenever you do this is a ijtihad, and this is a process which always, whenever you read other people's books or other people's disciplines, you are bound to be affected by them. And some of those effects are good and some of them are not good. So once Mu'tazila were defeated, then Ahl Hadith started arguing Asharis about things which were which they had Asharis had sort of in their view had gained in those things in which Asharis were influenced by Mu'tazila and Jahmiya while they were rejecting them. So they started criticizing Asharis regarding their use of philosophy and logic and their specific interpretation of Islamic belief system, which they developed in order to defend the Orthodox Islam. But once the Mu'tazila threat was gone, Ashari school didn't have an external enemy as such. Yeah, they're gone. So Ashari school became more lenient towards Greek philosophy and logic and all those things. And although their basic fundamental orthodoxy was never compromised, they were then hugely influenced by some of the ideas of Mu'tazila, some of the ideas of Greek philosophy, and some of the ideas of Greek logic. And they started incorporating Greek philosophy into their terminology, and also they started using Greek philosophy in order to interpret Islamic belief system. And in the absence of the adversary, they committed more and more errors as far as the interpretation of Orthodox Islamic, and that led to their infight with Ahlul Hadith. And then Ahlul Hadith, when some of them started learning their own Ilm al-Kalam and things, and developing their own Ilm al-Kalam, which develop into Hanbali school from the time of Barbahari and then Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Aqil and all those. Although some Hanbalis were Asharis, bulk of them developed their own Ilm al-Kalam, which they didn't call Ilm al-Kalam, but it is essentially Ilm al-Kalam. And then that Ilm al-Kalam, or Hanbali Ilm al-Kalam and Ashari Ilm al-Kalam, became two rival interpretation of the Orthodox Islam. And since there was no external enemy or external adversary, they started arguing with each other. So whenever Asharis are now talking, their main rival are Hanbalis, and Hanbalis, when they're talking, their main rivals are Asharis. And this leads to whenever there is an internal debate, there is always, there is a great chance of pushing each side into extremes. We'll see how that, and that makes them their positions, even though they agree on bulk of the issue, their interpretive arguments get heated up, and then they start calling out each other and calling each other kafirs or Mubtadi or Fasik or whatever, and their position in the process become extremes. And this has happened with Asharis as well as Hanbalis. And although Ilm al-Kalam, when you look at the definition is a justification of Islamic belief systems and defending Islam against the non-Islamic belief system. Since historically Kalam basically developed to defend Islamic orthodoxy against the views within Islam, other Islamic groups which were, deviant in the sense that which deviated from the Islamic orthodoxy. Ilm al-Kalam historically developed as an argumentative structure within Muslim schools of thought, rather. So Ilm al-Kalam doesn't have much experience as far as doing its real job, really, which is to justify Islamic belief system according to the most current knowledge of each age, and defend Islamic belief system against the external philosophical objections. So for example, Ashari school is very weak in that. If you see an Ashari talking about the old dispute, they are very sophisticated as far as their context is concerned, but when they talk against Marxism or Darwinism or materialism today, they have no clue, because their whole argumentative structure is built on basically Aristotelian metaphysics and Aristotelian logic. And the same with the Hanbalis. I'll see their argumentative structure is built on non-Aristotelian Greek and Syriac philosophies, which are mostly empiricists. And the problem with empiricism is that it's hugely influenced by common sense. And if the common sense is the Islamic common sense, that's fine. But when the common sense changes and the dominant common sense is non-Islamic, it becomes very weak. Hanbali school as well. So this is the context of these debates within these schools of thoughts within Ilm al-Kalam. So our Imam, that is Imam Ghazali, classifies these ideological differences between Hanbalis and Asharis, for example, as different ideological schools. But these ideological schools themselves, in their rivalry and their adversary, forget that they are ideological school, and they come to think of their disputes as disputes of Iman and Kufr, and then that leads to a lot of bad things, and then it's easy for them to become instruments of oppressive and non-Islamic regimes, because if you think the other is kafir or mubtadi', then obviously you're not going to care much about them. And Imam Ghazali warns against it, but strangely enough, even though he's Imam of Ashara just ignore those part of his things, as they ignore his critique of Greek philosophy to a large extent, and the real people who developed his critique against philosophy were Hanbalis, especially Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah and those people. Anyway, we'll get back to that. So ideological schools are distinguished by differences in their interpretive, argumentative structure, not in differences by their beliefs. So we talk about this argumentative structure a bit in the last session, but I'll add to that some important things today. So there's no difference between Hanbali as to Iman and Kufr, even though because of their rivalry they present their especially the extreme elements in them were always more vocal as the difference between Iman and Kufr, but actually their differences are not that of Iman or Kufr, because they agree on basic Islamic, like Arakan Islam and all that, basic belief system which brings a person into Islam or outside of Islam. So the Hanbali, the Asharis, Maturidis agree on Amantu Billah, belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and his on his Zat and Sifat. They agree that whatever Sifat has been mentioned in the Quran, you have to believe that. They don't reject. So in that they are different from Jahmiyyah and Mu'tazila, because they rejected Sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and rejected in the sense that they reinterpreted it as part of Zat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And based on their influence from the Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophy and Christianity, which was in itself, and Judaism, which themselves were hugely influenced by Greek philosophy and Roman philosophies and paganisms over centuries, as Quran mentions. And what was I saying? So they Mu'tazila, in their own estimation, they were defending Tawheed, but that Tawheed they invented themselves. Like, for them, Tawheed was that distinction between Zat and Sifat will create two gods, which is just preposterous unless you are totally blinded by Greek philosophy of a specific type. And similarly, you will see that the same happened to Ashara, because they were so much involved in Mu'tazila fight against it. So once they won, although they didn't they never compromised on Zat and Sifat, but they reinterpreted some Sifat in a way which, seems like, their rejection, in a sense, based on the argument that would lead to, for example, Tajsim and all that. But the whole notion of Tajsim is derived from Greek philosophy. So what I was saying was that, and similarly I can give examples of the same sort of influence from non-Aristotelian Greek and Syriac philosophies and Christian philosophies among Hanbalis, and their redefinition of Iman and Kufr. But if we look at from an independent perspective, the difference between, or the distinction between Hanbalis and Asharis and Maturidis is not of Iman and Kufr, because they all believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His sifat. Amantu billahi kama huwa bi asma'i wa sifatihi. And they believe His angels and prophets, the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa kutubihi, His books, and rusuli, wal qadr khair wa shar. So they believe in qadr. Ilmullah subhanahu wa ta'ala al-masbuq, regarding what happens in this world and His creation of khair and shar, and giving us the limited freedom to choose. Or they all believe in resurrection as well, and on the day of judgment, and they all believe amantu billahi wa kama wa bi asma'i wa sifati wa qabiltu jami'a ahkami iqraran bil lisani wa tasdiqan bil qalb. No one among Hanbalis or Ashris or Maturidis or any other school which are mainstream school in Islam reject any of these things, because these are the things which will lead you to inside or outside of the Islam, depending on the severity and all other condition obviously. So their main dispute is not about Iman and Kufr. So ideological schools are distinguished by differences in their interpretative, argumentative structures, not by their differences in belief. So I just explained why they are not. They don't have any difference as far as the fundamental beliefs is concerned, but they differ as to some interpretation about some beliefs, interpretation, and that arises because those belief systems, based on the text, actually are in need of interpretation, and their interpretation differs because of the different argumentative structures and different argumentative, interpretative strategies and interpretative methodologies. So I'll explain that. I explained a bit about these differences in the last session, but today I'll specifically explain the distinct difference between Hanbalis and Asharis in their rival interpretative methodologies and strategies, which lead to their different interpretation of the same belief system, some of the same belief system. Obviously, those beliefs which actually lend themselves to interpretation because they are not based on nas or some other things. So what's the difference between Hanbali and Ashari schools' methodological strategy? And I'm using this in a very broad sense. So let's say Ashari, and this is Hanbali. Okay, so now their main difference is based on the interpretation of the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's their basic difference. Both of them believe in all sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are certain sifat which Asharis interpret in one way, and Hanbalis interpret in another way. Although Hanbali claim that they don't interpret them, they just want Salafi, a method of the Sahaba and Tabi'in. But that's not true, because Sahaba and Tabi'in didn't interpret them. They just accepted them as they understood in the Arabic language. But Asharis and Hanbali had to interpret them because Islam spread into lands which not all of Muslims spoke Arabic anymore, and even those who spoke Arabic, they didn't have the same sense of Arabic as the earlier generation. And thirdly, then there were new terminologies, new philosophies arriving, and those philosophies like Greek philosophy, Aristotelian and non-Aristotelian logic reshaped the language as well as terminology. So it was impossible not to try to interpret those sifat in the face of those disputes. So they did what was needed to do, but they did using different strategies. And that doesn't mean that what they did was always right. But even if they are wrong, so that's ijtihad, and they are, they get ajr for that. The problem arises when they think that their dispute is that of iman and kufr. That's the problem, not the problem that they have differences and all that. And they differ on their interpretive strategies in various ways, but here is some the basics. The first is the focus of Asharis, historically or for whatever reason, is on showing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't resemble anything. So they focus on Quranic verse. Laysa kamithlihi shay. There's nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's their focus. That's their main goal. And anybody they see as compromising these, they consider them as mujassima of some sort. Like they consider them as likening Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to his creatures. And if people are actually doing that, then actually it's a grave thing. But it's not necessary that what they think is true because of the various things which I will come across. And when and on the other hand, the focus of Hanbalis is to not to focus on dissimilarities in too much detail. They said that it's enough for us to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't resemble any of his creation, and then elaborate on his positive characteristics, even if it might look like that some of the characteristics are similar to the characteristics of the creation. But they say that this is Quranic strategy because Quran doesn't bother about that, because as human beings we have no other way to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except through what can come in our imagination, and that's Quranic strategy as well. That negation is terse and to the point. It's not, Quran doesn't go into detail of that. It said nothing like him exists, nothing resembles him, he doesn't even come into your imagination. But then Quran goes on in detail to say he is Rahim, he is Rahman, he is Kareem, etc., etc. So that's their focus. So when Ashari sees Hanbali strategy, they sense the danger of compromising the uniqueness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that they see that as against the concept of Tawheed. And if it was actually happening, and at some point it does happen, then that's a legitimate fear. On the other hand, when Hanbalis see Asharis focusing on uniqueness, they fear, and that's a legitimate fear because it's a historically established fear, that they are ignoring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's characteristics which make him appear as a living God, and they're focusing on a philosophical concept of a God which make a God into something which really can't be related to and can't be posited. And it reminds them of some of the philosophical tradition in Greek philosophy, which was so focused on abstracting God from everything which exists that they end up saying that God is no thing. Because even if we say God is a thing, then there are other things. So or Jews, they don't even, some of the Jewish tradition, they don't even try to name God, because that might lead to, might compromise its uniqueness. But that's obviously a very dangerous way to go, because once you have this dead God, a God which is just an abstraction, a philosophical concept of God, you can't relate to that God, because we relate to God through his characteristics, through his sifatas. And this is a very legitimate concern as well. So they are overwhelmed by this concern, and Asharis are overwhelmed by this concern. And their debates makes their perceptions even more extreme and hardens their position. And Ashari goes to the left of their position, and Hanbalis also go to the right of their position, and they become extreme in their position, and the position which are no longer justified by the Islamic belief system, and sometimes. And then Ashari sees Hanbalis as Mujassima, Hanbali sees Asharis as Mu'attala. So, and if you are really Mujassima, and if you are really Mu'attala in the sense in which they are thinking of each other, then obviously you are compromising the Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But for very reason, obviously we know that this is not the case, because once they are out of their debate, and like when an Ashari is not doing Ilm al-Kalam, he's doing tafsir, or he's doing namaz, or he is prayer, salat, and he is doing although it's an act with God as any other Muslim acts. And similarly, when Hanbali is out of their Ilm al-Kalam and it goes to other material, they interpret them in a similar way. So their actual relationship with God actually is no different. But when they are within their specialization of Ilm al-Kalam, and that obviously created division among Muslims, and then it plays in the hands of enemy of Islam. It always has played, and even today it is playing in the hands of enemy. Both of them are playing in the hands of the enemies of Islam, especially extreme elements of them. So this the one reason for their difference in their interpretative strategy or methodology. I think probably I'll stop here, because we just have gone too long. So I'll just continue from here in the next session.